Hi, Heathens. Welcome back. I don't know why, but every time that countdown happens, I get anxious. It's my show. Anyway, today I have the privilege of having a Hebrew Bible scholar with us. His name is Mark Leuchter. I connected with him on Twitter, but I'm super, super grateful that he agreed to come on today. And Mark, why don't you take it away? Give us your background, what you specialize in, your areas of study.
Okay. Well, first of all, I'm really incredibly happy to be here. I find these things really fun, and I also think they're useful and really important. So I did my work at University of Toronto. That's where I got my PhD. And as if you couldn't tell by my Rush concert T-shirt and my coffee mug, I am deeply Canadian. And I represent the team everywhere I go as zealously as I can. My work is I'm currently the professor of Hebrew Bible and Ancient Judaism at Temple University in Philadelphia. Before that, I was at University of Sydney in Australia. And before that, I just was selling my soul to whichever college would hire me for a class here or a class there for 4 years in Boston, which was a really, difficult time. And I'm deeply sympathetic to people who are still doing that hustle right now. It's really hard. And that's it. I focus on prophecy. I focus on scribalism. I'm interested in empires and mythology. I'm interested in the history of the priesthood. And, I oftentimes just like to sit back and listen to how people respond to this stuff because I'm always learning new things from these people who offer interesting and fresh responses that I hadn't thought of before.
Oh, that's really interesting. I think part of why I'm so excited about this conversation is largely because, especially since being on Twitter for whatever reason, the absolute garbage Christian takes that I see about how the whole Old Testament is pointing to Jesus. And first of all, I find that to be incredibly, I don't know, anti-Semitic maybe? You tell me, but it seems very, at the very least, disrespectful and dismissive. And so I don't necessarily have the knowledge to say, well, actually, no, here is not what it's talking about. It's not talking about Jesus. It's talking about this. Or to say, well, this is what's going on in the background, so this is why it makes sense. So I'm super excited to be able to talk with you a bit about that. If you don't mind me asking, what has been your experience with Christians sort of on social media?
Generally, it's actually been pretty good. There are always people who just have so much hatred in their hearts, and it just, they happen to use Christianity as a vehicle to express it or to reify it or whatever. But generally, my experience, as with the rest of my life, really, and certainly as an academic, my experience with Christians has been actually really good, really productive. I find that a lot of times there are serious questions. People take the text seriously. People take intelligent readings of the text seriously, even if they don't agree with them. That's okay. And overall, it's been a good experience. Every now and then I find somebody who's just yeah, well, you're a Jew, so why should I listen to you? And I'm just okay, well, let's not have this conversation anymore. But yeah, overall, it's not been bad. It's been okay. For me, for other people, probably it might be different.
Fair enough. Okay, so maybe we can start with sort of a brief timeline. I'm sure a brief timeline is kind of like an oxymoron. But going from just before the fall of Israel to the Assyrians in, I believe it was 722 or something. And then sort of moving forward through the PostExilic period, or maybe the re-entry into Israel. I believe it's in the 6th century. Sorry, I have a couple notes on this, so I'm just checking. Okay, and so
that's great.
You know more than I do, far more than I do. So maybe start wherever you'd like, actually, and just sort of fill us in on what was going on.
Well, there's a lot to condense in that 200-ish year period, right? But I'll do my best. So the most important thing that I think we can take out of it is that, before the Assyrian period, Israel is ancient Israel, of course, is just another ancient Near Eastern culture. It has and I'm not talking about theology because I don't do theology. I am just a historian. And I respect that people have different theological opinions or commitments and all of that, and that's okay. But most of the stuff that I do just doesn't deal with it at all. What I do deal with is material culture. I deal with textual evidence. I deal with archaeology. I deal with sociology. And really, from what we can tell by an evaluation of all these things and how they converge, Israel before the rise of foreign imperialism was just another ancient Near Eastern culture in that part of the world. It did its thing the way that other neighboring nations did their thing. With the rise of foreign imperialism, everything really changes. And that's where we really see a sort of ramping up of things that would become, I think for a lot of people, probably familiar, maybe even normative in terms of how they understand biblical teachings or teachings that emerge from biblical texts is probably a better way to put it. It's with the coming of Assyria and the coming of the Babylonians, and then finally the Persian period, which lasted for 200 years after the Babylonian period ended. It's with this, almost 400 years of foreign imperialism that most of the Hebrew scriptures are committed to text. And when you're dealing with that kind of, I guess, cultural circumstance, it's almost impossible to imagine that older traditions are not somehow filtered through that in some way. So One of the things that I really try to do, and it's unavoidable, right? So one of the things that I try to do in my work is to try to say, all right, so if we have a text that reflects the mindset of somebody living in the Babylonian exile, or maybe the mindset of somebody living in the late monarchic period while the Assyrians are still kind of on the horizon somewhere. And this text is talking about things of a much earlier period, an earlier Israel, King David, maybe even Moses, things that happened much, much earlier in the timeline. How much of what they're saying tells us about what they remember, and how much of what they're saying tells us about what they're, I don't want to say inventing, but what they're determining is meaningful in their own time in light of the circumstances they're facing? Because I think that that's really where the more interesting questions are.
Right. And I think that, I know we've briefly talked about the Exodus, which I understand is far earlier, but there's this sort of interesting idea that comes up where it's like, what part of this is actually history? Is there a kernel of history in here? And then how are a people group that is starting to feel the heat from other nations, or that is currently under the rule of another nation, how are they then using these older stories and traditions to sort of self-actualize and give themselves hope for a potential future and liberation? And I know you don't do theology, but I think a lot of my listeners will be familiar with this idea of sort of how Jewish thought, and actually I'm sure you can speak to this, developed over time, where before they had no concept of really a serious afterlife either way. And then they're starting to need hope. And they're thinking, if we're God's people, we're following God's laws, why are we suffering so greatly? And so you start to see this sort of rise of, and this is over, I know, a very, very long span, but of like apocalyptic thinking, where there's going to be a cosmic battle and God's going to come basically create a new heaven and earth. And so I personally find it interesting to see how this sort of, I guess, theological thought evolved alongside this sort of retelling of traditions or stories and I guess, collective memory.
Yeah, that's a great way to put it. And I mean, there's definitely a sort of turning point, I think. Actually, the book I'm working on right now deals with this turning point in terms of Israelite writers, or I should say ancient Jewish writers, really focusing on this apocalyptic mindset. And I think it's happening towards the tail end of the Persian period, maybe at the very end, right as Alexander the Great is starting to rise. But there's things that sort of head in that direction and look in that direction, little wisps of ideas that would build in that direction for a long time. I think you brought up something really fascinating, and that is the idea of an afterlife. Ancient Israel, like most ancient cultures, did have a concept of the afterlife, but it was very sort of geolocal. In other words, you died, you went into the family tomb, you were gathered unto your ancestors, or you slept with your fathers. I mean, that's, the language that the biblical writers use to talk about what happens when somebody dies. He slept with his fathers, or, he joined his ancestors or something like that. Your body was put in the family tomb, and over time, your bones would decompose and they'd be swept into a large kind of cavern with all the other bones, and that's how you entered Sheol, the underworld. Well, I mean, the Babylonian exile made that impossible. If you were taken away from your land, how could you get into Sheol, right? So that's really, I really think that 50-year period of the Babylonian exile from 587-ish to 538 BCE, that's where some really tremendously new ideas are coming in that affected the way people read prophecy, that affected the very idea of what prophecy is or could be, and what community is or could be as well.
So let me ask you this. I've done some reading around how we presently define prophecy and how the ancient Israelites or Jewish thinkers would have defined prophecy. So I know that today, when we say this person is a prophet or they prophesied, we very much have this idea that the person is talking about some event in the future, something that is to come. And it might be to come a long time from now. It might be in short order, but there's very much this sense that it's a future prediction. And if I'm understanding correctly, the prophets in the Old Testament served a very different purpose. They were meant to be intermediaries between the people and God and the people. And so the message was often very much having to do with right that moment, as opposed to what they need to do in the future. And again, you correct me if I'm wrong on any of these points. The prophets also spoke very, I don't know, maybe hyperbole isn't the right word, but there was always these very severe consequences if you didn't, get right with God or start following the laws again or whatever was being required. But those consequences were always very immediate. It would be happening very soon. And I think that might be an important distinction for people. I don't know if you have anything to add on to that or correct.
I do, actually. And I think you're really right. We think of prophecy very often with a sort of future orientation. I mean, especially if people have confessional commitments like Jews and Christians, to read earlier texts that really predate the rise of these ideological systems. I think of the Israelite prophets not as Jews, and they weren't Christian. They were Israelites or maybe Judahites. They were laying the foundations for what would become in early Judaism, in early Christianity. And I think that it's fair to read those texts from both the Jewish perspective and a Christian perspective. I mean, Jews and Christians are the inheritors of these texts. So, from my point of view, that's kosher. But I also think that if we want to be intellectually honest about who these writers were, who these thinkers were, we have to remember that they lived at a time before some of those reading strategies really existed. So, when I think about somebody like Jeremiah, my dissertation was on the formation of the book of Jeremiah. I can't remember how many articles I've written on the book of Jeremiah. Jeremiah's like, you ever have that friend that like it's like 3:30 on a Wednesday morning and you're just trying to sleep because you have work the next day and you get a call and your friend's like, hey, what are you doing? Come on, let's go do something. That's like Jeremiah for me. I'll wake up at 3:30 in the morning and I'll just be like, no, get out of my head. But he's just here to stay.
That's
so
funny.
When I think about the book of Jeremiah, I think about prophecies that were really meant to address the here and now of Jeremiah's day. They were meant to address his audience in light of what the future might hold if they don't abide by their moral and ethical commitments. And I think that that's a fair way to read it. I think that's probably the best way to read it for certain outcomes, or the best way to read it, the best strategy for reading it for certain purposes. But as a colleague of mine noted in an essay in a volume that I published last year, something's also happening with prophecy around that time. So from the late 7th century BCE to maybe the late 6th century BCE, during that era, prophecy is also becoming more scribal. And it's not to say that prophecy wasn't scribal beforehand. I mean, the reason we have prophecy is because somebody wrote it down and transmitted it. So, I mean, scribalism was always a very big part of it. But there's a difference between writing down somebody's oral performance and writing something down from scratch at a desk. And that's what I mean by prophecy becoming more scribal. Like, so prophets are becoming more literate themselves. So you have prophets like Zechariah, for example. When we read Zechariah 1 through 8, or even Zechariah 9 through 14, which many scholars think come from somebody who's following in his footsteps, sort of expanding his book, these prophetic oracles are meant to be written. They're meant to be read. They're meant to be studied. It's almost like a wisdom text. There's something almost academic about it. And, we have to remember that science and religious belief were deeply intertwined in antiquity. So I think that a lot of times these prophets who are writing in this pivotal period are engaging in a kind of political science or natural science, along with engaging in religious proclamations and speaking on behalf of the divine. So it's not, I think, as cut and dry as we sometimes would want it to be. And it's, I think, important to recognize that when people are writing their prophecies down, they know that in the future people will be reading them. So it's around this time that some of these oracles have a deliberate kind of ambiguity to them, because they are meant to address the here and now. But Zechariah writing down his oracles is just like, I wonder how people are going to read this a century from now. I wonder how people are going to read this 2 centuries from now. So he might have constructed his oracles to address his audience, but also future audiences too. So I don't have a problem with people looking at prophecy and saying it's future oriented, but it's not only future oriented. And I think it's a little reductive to say so.
That's fair. I think that's a really good point. I've recently been doing some reading. I'm probably going to ruin this name, so apologies in advance. Geza Vermes. I think that's how you pronounce it. I don't know. But I've been reading about this. Vermes. Yeah. Hey, as long as you know who I'm talking about. This evolution of charismatic Judaism, and how there was sort of always 3 layers, or at least 2 layers, of the practice of Judaism going on. You had the very high level of like the kings, or I guess maybe the scribes. And then you also had this level where you were having these sort of ecstatic experiences, and sometimes it would be prophecy, and sometimes it would be other things that very much had to do with healing. And I believe he's referencing like Elisha and Elijah and all of these the sort of holy men of God that did all these great works. And then sort of third layer that's not as well recorded because it was very much done by the people. And so naturally, no one's recording it except for in sort of spurts. And so I'm curious if you know, sorry, this is a bit off the cuff because I just thought about it while you were talking.
Okay.
If this sort of rise in scribal prophecy has any sort of correlation with either the rise or maybe the fall of this charismatic sort of practice. Does that make sense?
Oh, I see what you're saying. Yeah, no, I know that does make sense. And I think you're getting at something that's really important. That is, there were many types of prophecy in antiquity, and certainly in ancient Israel. So you had these sort of wandering ecstatics, and maybe sometimes they weren't wandering ecstatics. They might have actually been connected to shrines and sanctuaries. I mean, the earlier we go, the more varied, I think, or maybe more inconsistent we find prophecy from place to place, and prophetic experiences. That's why you can have, a big, tall, strapping guy like Saul looking for his father's donkeys, and then suddenly the Spirit of the Lord descends upon him, and people go, is Saul also among the prophets? I mean, it was something that could be spontaneous, for certain people. But ultimately, in time, it becomes something that is part of the cult. And that's what the biblical prophets are actually critiquing to a certain degree. So prophets like Micah and prophets like Hosea and prophets like Jeremiah have problems with professional prophets who are on the king's payroll, basically. There's that famous moment in the book of Amos where Amaziah, the chief priest of Bethel, is saying to Amos, get out of here, go back to where you come from, but this is the king's house. This is really funny because Bethel literally means God's house. So here you have the high priest of Bethel, the high priest of God's house, saying this house belongs to the king. And by the king, he means King Jeroboam II. So Amos is like, boy, you don't even know what you're talking about. And Amos says, I'm not the kind of prophet that you think I am. I'm not a professional prophet. I was called to preach to you. So there are various types of prophets that are floating around ancient Israel. I do think that in time, really with foreign imperialism coming in, prophecy becomes a much more sort of deliberate and controlled type of phenomenon. And when I mean controlled, I mean that you find sort of official prophets doing official things, either on behalf of the king or maybe to criticize the king. But I don't see as much evidence for a sort of spontaneous prophecy all over the place happening at later periods of time. And certainly by the time we get to the post-exilic period, where Jews are coming back from Persia and Babylon to rebuild Jerusalem, it really seems like the prophets that have a lot of authority are the prophets that are connected to power structures. They're sort of prophets on the inside, as opposed to outsider prophets pulling a George Carlin and saying, here's what's wrong with you. So, things, and in my classes, actually, when I introduce prophecy to my students, I play them 2 video clips. One is Martin Luther King Jr.'s final speech, which is, I've gone up to the mountain and I've seen the promised land. And it's a brilliant speech. It's just electrifying. I get chills every time I see it, every time I hear it. And then I play them George Carlin going on a rant about how God loves you. I should send you the clip. It's a really brilliant clip. And what I tell my students is that, these are comedians, but they're comedians that are doing 2 very well. Martin Luther King Jr. wasn't a comedian, but these are thinkers, and one of them is a comedian, but they're doing two very different things. One of them is operating from within a religious tradition, saying we have to come back to the basis, the ethical and moral basis of this tradition. Another one is an outsider, that's Carlin, pointing at a religious tradition or pointing at, the foundations of a religious tradition and saying, these foundations are messed up, and here's where you're going wrong. So this is not unlike, I think, what we're seeing around that time. You have these prophets that are, they sort of agree on what to discuss, but they have very, very different points of view on where the discussion will go.
Yeah, makes sense. Just to back up slightly, was it during Jeroboam the first reign that Israel and Judah split, or was that later?
No, that was during the reign of Jeroboam the first. I mean, technically, if you read 1 Kings chapter 12, it looks like it was just before the split. It was just before the reign of Jeroboam the first. 1 Kings chapter 12, verse 16, it's right after Rehoboam, the son of Solomon, gets up and says, you think my dad was tough, I'm going to be way tougher. And all the leaders of the 10 tribes say, screw you guys, I'm going home.
Right.
I mean, they really say to your tents, O Israel, which is like the closest thing to Cartman saying, screw you guys, I'm going home. And then Jeroboam comes to power. So, I mean, it's right around that time. Okay.
And what, if anything, do you think that split would, Jesus Christ, how would it have affected the prophets of the time, or what they were talking about?
Well, now, oh boy, you just lit a fire under the keg right there. The powder keg is about to go off, because as I think my last book was all about this, and chapters 2 and chapter 3 and oh, okay. Well, let me tell you, my last book was all about this. And chapter 2, chapter 3, and chapter 4 deal with this issue. And so I'm going to try to give you the Cliff Notes version, or else we'll be here all day. I think at that time, prophecy and priesthood they aren't two separate things. I think that they're really closely related. And there are prophets, but they're sort of loosely connected to a developing priestly group or priestly culture in ancient Israel. I will tell you this. Jeroboam, when he founds the northern state, he also comes up with a northern state cult. And he sort of tries to, as many scholars have noted, he tries to out-archaize, I'm doing scare quotes right here, out-archaize what you find in Jerusalem. So he tries to use earlier iconography, he tries to use earlier liturgy, he tries to weave in earlier ideas that predate the rise of the monarchy, as if to make his state cult more authentic than what you would find in the south in Judah with Jerusalem. That included coming up with a new priesthood, and from most of the biblical sources that we have, and there's both archaeological and anthropological evidence to support it, that meant disenfranchising the traditional Levite priesthood, which up until that time had been sort of calling the priestly shots for, a century and a half or so. So it's right around that time, I think, that Levites start to develop a tradition of protest that really gives rise to the kind of classical prophecy that we see in the 8th century and then, the 7th and the 6th century. I mean, that's much more literary prophecy, but it draws from ideas and complaints and liturgies that I think emerged from this Levite protest against a corrupt state that wrote them out of the script.
And so, were the Levites both in Judah and Israel? That's right, yeah, Judah and Israel, right?
Yeah, and that's the $1 million question also, because, depending on how you're reading these texts, the priests in Judah are just a family from the Levite tribe. Okay. But if you and there are people who argue that, and I'm not going to say that that's wrong, but there are also other ways of reading the sources that align a little bit better with anthropological evidence. And what I and a lot of my colleagues would argue is that before the Levites were a tribe, and I do think they eventually become a tribe, but before they were a tribe, they were sort of social caste. They were a type. Okay. I think of Levites as a kind of caste of sort of living saintly figures that develop priesthoods and priestly traditions around them. And you had, all kinds of Levites all over the place, but eventually most of them seem to be in the north. You do have priests in the south. You do have wandering holy men in the south, but the Levites as a sort of unified caste that eventually does become tribalized, they're mostly a group of northern priests. And it's really only, I think, with the fall of the north that a lot of them come down into the south for asylum.
Okay, and that was in 722 when the Assyrians took over effectively. Yeah. Okay. Yeah, I have a question. I was doing a little bit of reading about the book of Micah, and it appears that there might be a little bit of controversy over if the earlier part of Micah was written earlier and the later part was written much later. I know it's not certainly not a consensus by any stretch, but I'm wondering if you could give any kind of thoughts or context on the assembly of that book and why people might think it's written at separate times.
Micah is a conundrum for me for many reasons. So I'll just sort of give you like the broad consensus, or the range of ideas that most people find usable within the field. Almost everybody agrees that Micah chapters 1 through 3 come from the prophet Micah directly and date from between, say, 720 BCE to 700 BCE. In fact, that famous oracle in Micah chapter 3 where he says, because of you, Zion will be plowed like a field and the Temple Mount will be an overgrown, forest, where he's talking about the destruction of Jerusalem, which of course ultimately comes true, but after his lifetime. That seems to be an oracle that he comes up with right as the Assyrians are besieging Jerusalem in 701 BCE. So, there's a real sort of living world behind those chapters. The other chapters are a little bit more open to grabs. There's stuff in chapter 4 that looks a lot like earlier parts of the book of Isaiah, and many people think that stuff from Isaiah was copied and transplanted into Micah chapter 4 because it was right around the late 8th century or early 7th century that these early prophetic oracles were being brought together into a kind of collection, and this would help them resonate at the same frequency. But I do think that there's stuff in the other chapters. I think there's stuff in Micah 6. I think there's stuff in Micah 7. There's stuff in Micah 5 that we can say either comes from Micah or somebody a lot like him or people who are carrying on in his tradition that tell us a little bit more about him. There's a lot of authentic stuff that really doesn't seem to be just later scribal stuff entered into the record.
And that would have been in the post-exilic period that they were writing?
It might not have been. I mean, some people would say, yes, it's all post-exilic, but, I have a problem with that. One of the problems that I have with that, and listen, I'm not saying that there's not a lot of post-exilic stuff going on. I mean, there's really a lot of editing and redacting, and people are writing a lot of stuff out, and oral traditions are being committed to text because Jerusalem's rebuilt. You can start doing this stuff again now.
Right.
So I'm not saying there isn't a lot of stuff going on, around 500 BCE or to 450 BC. I mean, no, that's okay. But I think that a lot of the stuff that we have in Micah and in Isaiah and Hosea and Amos really are from the 8th and 7th century. Some of it is linguistic. I mean, if you do a linguistic analysis of the Hebrew, it just doesn't sound like Hebrew of a later period. And somebody could make the argument, well, that's a late scribe using early forms. And I mean, that's okay. I get that. And it is an argument. But you also have to triangulate that with other bits of evidence. And there are a lot of things in some of these prophetic books that a later scribe wouldn't have been able to just cook up. Here's a really good example. Jeremiah has this very famous temple sermon in Jeremiah chapter 7, where he gets up and he says, amend your ways or this whole place is going to come crashing down and God will do to this place what he did to Shiloh a couple hundred years ago. If that sermon was from a later scribe, 150 years later, we wouldn't have had such a specific reference to Shiloh. Jeremiah was a prophet in Jerusalem, but his family traced its lineage to the Shiloh priesthood. So this is somebody talking about their own family history and the history of northern Israel that would have been sustained and told, for generations within their family priestly structures. A generic scribe in Jerusalem in 500, BCE would not have been able to come up with that. So periodically, when you find these linguistic traditions that look like they're a little older and some authentic cultural flourishes that don't look like they're stereotyped, the likelihood is that it's probably an older text. I'm okay with later redaction of older text, but I think the idea that it's all late and we should just push it aside, no, I can't get with that.
Yeah, no, I think that's really interesting, and it's perspectives like these that I feel like I would have never gotten as an evangelical. So I mean, I don't know. I think I've told you a little bit. I spent like 20 some odd years as an evangelical Christian, and the way they read the Bible is vastly different than the way that scholars do, or even that anybody else does, really. And so reading through the prophets, it was always very. It's kind of a weird hodgepodge that they give you between like, oh yeah, they're talking about Israel here because they need to do X, Y, or Z, and then so much of it being like, oh no, this is actually a reference to Jesus. But that's like effectively all you get. It's these two sort of points, right? Like Israel needs to repent. This is about Jesus. And so having the opportunity to learn from people now who have studied this in such a very different way, it makes the text so much richer and more interesting to see how they evolved, how later people might have wanted to shape things, how we know certain parts are likely authentic and early. I think I appreciate the Bible so much more now than I ever did when I was a Christian, because it's telling such a more vibrant story.
I agree. It really is. And I get students who come into my class, and I teach, a lot of different religion classes. The one I'm teaching this semester is religion and film, which is just gangbusters awesome. But we just watched Taxi Driver, and we saw Pulp Fiction, and we're watching The Babadook this coming week. So, I mean, there's lots of good stuff going on in that class. But, my bread and butter obviously is in biblical literature, because that's, where I do most of my research. And I used to be a cinematographer, by the way, which is why I do film stuff. And, back in the Paleolithic, when we actually shot on film, all the cameras, these kids with their long hair and digital cameras, I don't get it, so anyway, hey, I'm going to be 50 in October. I get to say stuff like that now. So,
hey,
just indulge.
No complaints here, No, that's actually really interesting.
I understand what you mean. Yeah, it gives me some really unique perspective on some of the stuff that is more specific to my research when you take a step back and you teach a different kind of course. But when I teach my Intro to Bible courses, I really oftentimes have a lot of students coming in, either from very religious Catholic backgrounds, or very religious Protestant backgrounds, or very religious Jewish backgrounds. And, they don't know how to digest some of the ideas that I'm suggesting to them. And I never want to turn anybody away, and I never want to really turn anybody off. So one of the things that I try to get them to think about, and one of the things that I've been thinking about a lot more too, is the difference between text and literature. Text is material, right? Literature is almost much more of a phenomenon. And so to have literature, and I use film as an example of this, and in order to really have a film, you have to have an audience. And that audience has to watch and interpret and react to that film. Otherwise, it's just an inert, digital tape or reel of acetate that needs to be projected. It's not like a film experience unless you have an audience. It's not really literature unless you have an audience either, I think. So if you're looking at the prophetic text just as text, which is what I do because I'm very nuts and bolts in the kind of research that I do, then yeah, we can get behind the world of the text. But if you're looking at prophetic literature as literature, then I think it's to a degree, and if you're honest about it, I think it's fair to read it as something that needs an audience, and therefore the audience is part of the experience. And the needs and I think values and priorities of the audience, we have to account for that. So I don't have a problem with somebody looking at Isaiah 53, the suffering servant, and seeing Jesus in that, because the way that I suggest to them is that as a literary enterprise, since you're part of this enterprise, if that's what you're reading from it, that's legit, as long as you also realize that might not be what Isaiah himself or Deutero-Isaiah, whoever it was who wrote that, necessarily had in mind. That's where literature is different than just text.
I'm glad that you find that okay, because it drives me insane when people are like, haven't you read Isaiah 53? Mm-hmm. No, never. Yeah. I've never read that.
No, never.
Like, no,
never
what? Huh? And I think mostly it drives me bonks, because all it tells me when somebody says that is they haven't read the preceding verses or the verses that come after, right? Like, they didn't read the setup. And so therefore somebody told them this is about Jesus. They went and read the verse and were like, oh my God, how could that not be about Jesus? When in reality,
by the way, that's also very Jewish. That's a way that Jews have read text for a long time. I mean, the abstraction of a particular half of a sentence in order to form an idea out of it. So, I mean, and it's not just in like the rabbinic literature that people do this, it's with the biblical literature too. So if you'll indulge me for a second, when I was young, I once was young, I was working at a summer camp, and the camp just started to get into sending out emails during the year to people who had worked the previous summer, so maybe they'll come back and work at the summer. And it was a Jewish summer camp. It was run by the Jewish Theological Seminary of America. It was, it was like a conservative Jewish, kind of progressively oriented, but still pretty Jewish camp. And so the director of the camp was a rabbi, and he sent out this email where he was talking about the the Torah reading of the week and the prophetic reading that goes along with it, and it was from the book of Malachi. And he says, and this book contains, one of the most beautiful sentiments in the entirety of the Hebrew scriptures, and it's, and I will turn the hearts of the parent to the child and the hearts of the child to the parent, and isn't that lovely? And we should have that in mind. And so I responded to him, and I said, but, I don't want to say his name, but I said, but, camp director, you're forgetting the second part of that statement, which ends with, lest I come and smite the earth with utter devastation. What I didn't know is that I also hit reply all. So 1,200 people got my response. And I was not invited to come back to camp that summer on staff, but that's okay.
That's funny. That sounds like something I would do. Mm-hmm. Yeah, I mean, like, I get it. I get why they see it there. It's just, I don't know. Maybe I take a very hard line on these things, but I think I get so frustrated by hearing Christians constantly say that, like, well, the Old Testament is so clear. When in reality, it's just that you're not reading. Like, you're not reading the text. I'm not saying you can't see it there, but, like, it's actually not clear if you're reading the entirety of the text. Or if it is clear, it's clear that it's talking about the nation of Israel and that,
it's really troublesome, isn't it? But people read this very long book in a very selective way, and they always have. Right? So you form in your head what you want to hear, or what you want to know. You find the text that supports it, boom, you're done. But you don't find the other text that might complicate the issue. And I'm not saying it negates the issue, but it does complicate it. And I think that a colleague of mine put this really well. The critical method can be understood by both Christians and Jews who have deep confessional commitments as a gift from God. Because what it does is it enables you to see the complicated, multidimensional, multifaceted nature of every single verse of Scripture. And that reading one verse out of context might give you something that's meaningful, but it's not the only way that that verse is meaningful, and it might not even be the most meaningful to you unless you read it in a different way. So I oftentimes think that the critical method can make it difficult for people who have deep religious convictions to look at the text as a sort of pristine text that, preaches a particular idea. But it also gives people an opportunity to maybe it's a way to think of it this way. Maybe the text, if you're a religious person, you can view it as the text calling you to look at its deeper meaning beyond just what you think it means. And engaging that deeper meaning, which can be troublesome and can be bumpy and can be unpleasant, that might be a more meaningful religious experience for you. It is for a lot of my colleagues who are both confessing Christians and also biblical scholars, and that's why they are able to do it.
Yeah, I've always sort of wondered how... because of course I deal a lot with apologists, but a lot of them aren't biblical scholars. They're people that just want to defend the faith, and they don't really have a ton of credentials. They just sort of listen to other people, and that's fine. I mean, obviously I'm not a biblical scholar either, but it makes a lot more sense that what they're doing, right? They have something to defend, they find the information that defends it, and okay. But when you're a biblical scholar who actually engages in these rigorous methods of examination and understanding, I find it really interesting when people are able to reconcile both very committed faith and intellectual honesty with what they're doing, because I couldn't do it, and I wasn't even a scholar.
It's hard. It's a real challenge. I mean, in some ways it's easier for me because there's, you ever heard the joke, if you find two Jews, you'll get three opinions? I mean, it's really true. And it goes all the way back to the earliest days of interpreting biblical scripture. I mean, even Jeremiah and Ezekiel, in the late 6th century, the early 6th century BCE, are interpreting verses or ideas or aphorisms or statements that must have been sacred in vastly different ways. And the early rabbis are doing this too. I mean, Paul is doing it also. Paul is trained in all the methods that, the Pharisees knew. And when you read, and I'm not an expert in New Testament literature at all, but I know how the early rabbis worked, and I know that Pharisaic thought provided some conceptual building blocks for that, and Paul knows it real well. So throughout the history of Judaism, disagreement has been the pathway to holiness, not like necessarily agreeing on a party line. So it's easier for me, I think, to have some of my assumptions challenged, to come from an Orthodox Jewish world, which is how I was brought up, to now being, for the last 20 years or so, a biblical scholar and a historian. It doesn't affect, I don't want to say that, it doesn't challenge my Jewishness, because my
Yeah.
Jewishness is not based on a particular reading of a text. My Jewishness is based on traditions of interpretation that are constantly open to reformulation. And that has nothing to do with my scholarly work, but my scholarly work does affect my sense of Jewishness. And I don't know how Christians do it. It must be very challenging.
Yeah, I mean, I had Rabbi Hannah on last month, and we were sort of discussing this idea that Jews are tasked with asking questions, with wrestling with the text, and with trying to understand it. That it's part of their process, and there doesn't have to be this one definite outcome. And I think that's very, very different than what you get, especially in evangelical circles, where you're told what the doctrine is. That's the only right answer. And if you can't get your mind to make it sort of all make sense, you're the problem, not the text, not anything else. It's you're not doing it right. And I think that's probably why this very hard line causes many people who really just can't make all of these things jive to just say, well, I guess I gotta go. Because you're either being dishonest with yourself or dishonest with your sort of faith, and it's hard to do both. Okay, sorry. So I got us off topic there.
Don't apologize. That was really great. It's a meaningful discussion we're having.
Good. I'm glad. I'm really enjoying this conversation. I'm keeping an eye on the time because I could probably talk about this stuff all day long. So could you give people, I think they might be interested to know that the book of Isaiah, most people, I think, would agree that it was sort of written in 3 parts and then put together at a sort of later date. And I'm wondering if maybe you could give us some background on that, some context, sort of maybe even how we know that.
Sure. I want to preface this by saying that Isaiah is like, it's like, I don't want to call it Mount Everest because people have climbed Mount Everest. Isaiah is like K2. It's that mountain that like I don't think anybody has managed to fully scale. It's so complicated, and I understand why it's so central to Christian identity as well. If I remember correctly, sometimes it's referred to as the 5th gospel, and I know that one of my PhD advisors was a student of Brevard Childs, and Childs was at Yale. And, a very committed Protestant. And my thesis advisor was a Jesuit, but my other thesis advisor was a student of Childs, and he was also a Methodist minister. And so we had long conversations about Isaiah and what Isaiah means as Christian scripture. And that actually really helped me come to terms with what it just means as ancient Israelite literature, too, because I think that the interpretation and the history of interpretation can tell you something about what's being interpreted as well. So I got a lot out of that. But the book itself, just on its own terms, is really bumpy. There used to be a prevailing theory that, there was first Isaiah, who was the actual titular, prophet, and then there was second Isaiah, who wrote chapters 40 to 55, and he lived sometime during the Babylonian exile toward the end, because he mentioned Cyrus, and of course Cyrus becomes the first king of Persia. And then there's Trito Isaiah, or third Isaiah, who is writing in the early Persian period, and sort of like a bitter version of second Isaiah, because none of the stuff that second Isaiah had to say actually came true in his own day. And I think by and large, most scholars still go with that model, but it's also a little bit more complicated because there's stuff in First Isaiah that doesn't really look like it came from First Isaiah. And there's stuff in between First and Second Isaiah that gets credited to First Isaiah, but probably came from Second Isaiah. So there's a brilliant and really complicated section. I think it's in Isaiah 36 to 39, which is taken right from the Book of Kings. So I mean, it's the same stuff. I mean, the differences are so minor, you can assign them to like scribal error. So it's substantially the same things what you find in the Book of Kings. And so it becomes a really, really complicated book. What that means, though, and I think what people who study the book of Isaiah, especially Christian scholars I know who study the book of Isaiah and take it really seriously, is that Isaiah becomes a literary witness to evolving ideas of identity. And that's why these different parts are brought together as a sort of statement on the fact that things don't stay the same. And what you think means A might actually mean A plus B at another point in time. And that's why they're brought together under the banner of Isaiah, as if to say a prophetic message never just means one thing. And, I don't know enough about theology to really dig into that. But if the divine word really is part of the divine, then you can't reduce it to one, flat topic that only means one thing or only points in one direction. And the book of Isaiah is maybe a really good witness to that on the literary level.
Yeah, that's really, really interesting. I think I will hear that sometimes from people, that yes, the book of really whatever says this, but there's a secondary meaning there, right? So it says this, and it might be talking about Israel, but it's also a foreshadowing of Christ or something like that. Mm-hmm. And so there's, okay, like, I guess you can think of it that way. That feels very much like like you need to make it work. So, but if you're thinking of, I guess, the Bible as something like you're saying, like a literary or as literature, then it's more of like a living document. And I know that, at least I think that Torah is thought of in the same way, right? As a living document that evolves.
I think all of it
to wrestle with.
Yeah. All of it is. I mean, the Torah, of course, is just the Pentateuch, but Torah in Judaism, the word Torah really means both oral traditions and oral teachings, but also, the entirety of the Hebrew Scriptures. That's understood as Torah. So, and yeah, this is exactly the case. It is a living document. It does speak. It does sort of evolve, from the Jewish point of view to mean different things in different ways. And I think that early Christians probably viewed those scriptures the same way. And modern Christians might do the same thing. It's not anathema to a critical reading. It doesn't. They don't have to be, allergic to each other. It really depends on whether somebody is willing to be intellectually honest while also being religiously committed. And those things can work together, but it requires certain negotiations and thinking that a lot of people just don't want to do.
Yeah, it's something I was sort of reflecting on the other day was the inability of a lot of, at least in my experience, Christians. I know that's a very broad term. I know not all Christians, like, I get it. Don't come for me in the comments. But there's a real inability to hold this intellectual tension between two competing ideas, one of which they don't want it to be, right? Like, they don't want this concept that doesn't agree with them or doesn't affirm their doctrine or however you want to phrase it. And so it's far too uncomfortable for them to hold those two competing notions. And so they just don't. They just toss one out of hand and say, no, that's wrong. That's wrong for any number of reasons. Doesn't really matter why. It's just wrong, and I'm not going to deal with it.
There are Jews that do that also. But my answer to that, at least to Jews who engage in the same sort of like, that's wrong, we're not going to talk about that kind of process, is that in the rabbinic literature, there's a great moment where a couple rabbis are having a discussion, and I think a third rabbi resolves the discussion, the debate really, because they're arguing with each other, by saying the Hebrew phrase, and I'll say it in Hebrew and then I'll say what it means in English, Elu ve'elu divrei Elohim chayim, which literally means both of these are the words of the living God. So the contradictions are both holy. And it doesn't mean, sometimes one position might be more appropriate than another, but they're both holy. So this is not something, I mean, it's part of the Jewish tradition, but, Jews and Christians can talk to each other and learn things from each other. I mean, there's actually evidence that Rabbi Akiva knew and interacted with ideas of heaven that were being cultivated in early Christianity at the time. So, for a long time, Jews and Christians were learning from and supporting each other and influencing each other, and I think that they still can. And if that gives people a better tool set, another tool in the box that they can use to approach these texts that they find very meaningful and sort of formative to their identity, then I say go for it. I can't ask somebody to do something that they don't want to do or that they don't believe in, but I would caution them to just stop short of saying this is wrong, and instead say, does this work for me? I mean, that's a very different kind of evaluation, and it gets you to the same place. So why not go for it?
Yeah, I think you may be giving evangelicals a bit too much credit. I hate to put it that way, but like when I was growing up, if I would have asked, like, does this work for me? The answer, it wouldn't have mattered if it worked for me. Now, as an adult, if I was approaching this in the same way, of course I could have that thought process now, but it wasn't about, what does this work for me? Could it? It was very much like, no, that's not what our specific sort of doctrinal stance is, therefore wrong. And I think what you're saying is very optimistic, and I would like people to do that.
But maybe I should qualify that a little bit. Maybe if we're talking about people who are deeply committed to a conservative evangelical worldview, or reading of text, maybe the question should be, does this work for me as an evangelical? Right. Can my value system and my priorities accommodate this? And even once you even just ask the question, I think the opportunity to expand the parameters of what might be an authentic religious experience suddenly changes a little bit, or at least it changes your relationship to it.
Okay, so before I let you go, I have two more things. I would love to spend a few minutes talking about the book of Daniel. Yes. I love Daniel. I love and I hate Daniel. I love Daniel because I think when you really start studying it more critically, it becomes this really fascinating piece, right? It's written sort of in two parts. You get a lot of this really interesting symbolism that you see show up again in Revelation, which is like my favorite book to talk about. And of course, the one that everyone tells me I'm a heretic for and I'm going to burn in a fiery pit of hell. But
sorry. I'll see you there, I guess.
I guess, yeah. I'm like, do you think I want to go where you guys are going? Like, I don't, not I. Anyway, so yeah, I guess whatever you'd like to say about Daniel, I find it really fascinating, but I think it would be useful for people that don't already know to sort of have a little historical, social, cultural background on when these two parts were written and perhaps why they were written.
This is, boy, Daniel, man, oh my God. Daniel is like the dark side of the moon of the Bible. I mean, it's got that Pink Floyd quality to it where like every line and there's stuff running under the surface and, you know, and it's every time I read it. Were they on acid or were they just talking about Syd Barrett who was on acid? I don't know. The myth of, I was always much more of a Rush guy, as you can see, than a Pink Floyd guy. So, and they were definitely on something Rush. I don't know. So they actually wrote the most intelligent song about pot smoking ever written. It's called A Passage to Bangkok, and it's on the album 2112. You got to listen to that thing. It's a masterpiece. Yeah.
Okay.
Yeah. All right. But you know, that's a different conversation that we can have. Daniel's fascinating for a couple different reasons. I'll only talk about three, okay, because I know we're a little short on time. One is that, yes, there are two parts to Daniel, but they're also not two parts, because you can say the first 6 chapters are court tales and the last 6 chapters are visions. But some of the court tales are in Aramaic, and one of the visions is also in Aramaic. So the book that could be easily split like this suddenly has like an interlocking kind of thing with the language that's being used. The first chapter is Hebrew, the last 4 chapters are Hebrew, the middle chapters are Aramaic, but one of those chapters is a vision, which, and the rest of the visions are in Hebrew. So the use of language makes that sort of split down the middle a little harder to do. And it makes us ask the question, why does this book use language like that?
May I ask, does it appear that the Aramaic was sort of dropped in to the Hebrew from like a later writing, or are you able to date the language in such a way that it's like Aramaic from that same time period? Does that make sense?
Yeah, almost everybody who studies the book of Daniel thinks that the Aramaic that we find is like original to the composition of Daniel.
Okay.
Now it's likely that there were court tales about a guy named Daniel that had been circulated for a long time. But in terms of actually putting those court tales down into a text, a book about a character named Daniel, that probably happened the same time the Aramaic stuff is there. Okay. So, I mean, the Hebrew and Aramaic is written from the same scribal pen, or from the same group of scribes. Okay. So that's the first thing. The language is just kind of bonkers, but also fascinating. The second thing is that, Daniel chapter 9 is one of my favorite chapters of the entire collection of scriptures, both Jewish and Christian scriptures, because what you have is Daniel, as a character, right? He's sitting at this desk, and he's saying, I'm trying to make sense of this oracle from Jeremiah, but I just can't figure it out. And a lot of people think he's actually reading Jeremiah's oracle, but he's not. He's reading stuff about Jeremiah's oracles. If you actually read the text carefully, it says, Daniel is sitting there studying the books on Jeremiah's oracle. I think I wrote an article about this. I think he's actually reading the book of Chronicles, which talks about Jeremiah's, end of Babylonian reign oracle. And he just can't get with it. He doesn't understand why the authors of these books about Jeremiah's oracle think the exile has ended when he still sees himself in sort of a spiritual and existential exile. And then he prays, and the prayer, by the way, in Daniel chapter 9 is probably an old prayer. Some people date it to the era of the Babylonian exile or the early Persian period. So if Daniel chapter 9 was written somewhere around 160 BCE, as most scholars think that it was, the person living in this mid-2nd century is taking a 200-year-old prayer and plopping it right down in the middle of Daniel chapter 9.
Why not?
After he appeals to, it's if it's there, use it. it would have automatically made people like pay attention because they were probably familiar with it. After he's done praying this prayer, that's when the angel comes down and reveals to him the deeper meaning of Jeremiah's oracle. So Daniel 9 is actually making the case that biblical scripture, it doesn't mean one thing. It can't mean one thing. The meaning of the text changes over time. And so whether you're looking for meaning on the critical level or whether you're looking for meaning on a theological level, saying this is what it means, end of story, well, we closed the books on that. Daniel chapter 9 is like, no, not at all. In fact, if you do that, you're not being pious like Daniel was. So I love Daniel chapter 9. I'll come back to it as many times as I can. But really, it's the end of Daniel in chapters 11 and 12 that starts using language from Isaiah, and it uses language from the creation story in Genesis chapter 1 to suggest that, new wisdom. And Daniel is not a prophetic book. It's a wisdom book. Daniel is a visionary seer, but he's not really a prophet. These visionary seers who are learned in the text and willing to engage in ancient scientific ways of thinking about the text, these seers can understand creation and understand it unfolding in front of their eyes anew. So in many ways, I think Daniel is making a case for thinking through text to understand its meaning as opposed to just reading and walking away from it. It's really asking the reader to use their cognitive faculties to make sense of material that might otherwise seem like it has a very simple thing to say, but really doesn't.
Yeah, that's fascinating. I never picked up on that in all my days of reading Daniel, which, to be honest, isn't surprising.
Let's talk about Daniel all the time, on Twitter. I mean, and next time you text me on Twitter or message me or whatever, just drop a Daniel in there. We'll have a conversation about it. I love that book.
I'd love that. I'm actually working on doing a longer form on Revelation where I talk about the relationship between the symbolism in Daniel and in the book of Revelation. So maybe we can have some conversations about that.
Sure.
Great. Well, okay. Well, I'm going to let you go because I think we've had you here for over an hour. But thank you so very much for being willing to chat with me. I had such a great time. This was very enlightening. Before we go, do you have anything you'd like to sort of plug? Your Twitter, any books coming out, whatever you'd like?
Well, there are two things. One, I love interacting with people on Twitter. Please be nice to me. I'm Canadian. I don't know how to I don't know how to handle rudeness very well, but my Twitter handle is @MarkLeuchter. So just, find me, send me a message. Be happy to talk to you. The only other thing that I'd want to promote is that I'm, as you know, I also do electric guitar stuff because I'm a musician and I make fuzz pedals for guitar players. And I'm doing a fundraiser campaign right now to raise money for Ukrainian refugee aid and humanitarian aid.
Yeah.
And I'm making fuzz pedals, and 100% of the profits are going to go to the humanitarian aid. And we've raised a fair amount of money so far, but I'm going to keep this going as long as there's a humanitarian need. So if you know people who play guitar and you know people who are interested in, great sounding 1960s hippie fuzz. In fact, the name of the pedal that I'm selling is called the Dirty Hippie. And it sounds fantastic. It's just like, that's the sound I've been looking for a long time. So, come talk to me about that too, and I can tell you more about that.
Yes, please talk to him because I have no idea what you just said. So don't hit me with the questions, but please do to him. I will put his Twitter handle in the show notes. Yeah, thanks for being here. I had a great time.
Oh, I did too. Thank you so much for having me. It's just wonderful.
Of course. Hopefully we can do it again.
Absolutely.
All right. Have a great day.
You too.
Bye.
Bye.